number 3 is the law of connection. The conversations are the work. Those of you that are familiar with us, we are entirely founded and rooted in this belief that conversation and connection are vital to what we can accomplish. And in this context, when we're talking about connection, we're not just talking about connection to one another, though that's really important, but also connection to the reality of what we're in together, and that all of that gets accomplished through conversation and the quality of our interactions. What else would y'all have to say just to establish why there's a law of connection and what conversation has to do with that?
The first time I can recall saying the conversations are the work in that particular phrase, we were with a group of highly technical folks, and we'd been spending some time with folks getting really well connected to things about their customers and their customer experience. And at the end of it, somebody said, "But did we get anything done today?" And we said, well, the conversation, they said, all we did is talk. Because they were looking for what was the specific task that they were going to leave to go and accomplish. And I think this idea of teams really needing this deep connection, and that conversation is the way to do that. And that is work. Sometimes it's really pleasurable work, sometimes it's really hard work, but it is the work of actually teams coming together to produce something, because most of that happens in some form of conversation. Anybody who's been in a room with us will expand the definition of conversation to include asynchronous conversations as well. So things like email and text and Teams and Slack or whatever your format is. But that is the way that we're actually getting work done when we're collaborating with one another.
Well, I think the two primary distinctions for us inside of the conversations are the work are the quality of conversation and the timing of conversation. And for us, the measure of quality is unsupervised action following the conversation. So in that meeting, if the work was successful, what happened afterward is actually the evidence of the success. Mm-hmm. Because if you had people thoroughly resolve open questions, make the right choices together, align behind those choices in a way that each of them is committed, then they go out and do the work, and it's startling to them how much they accomplish per unit of time. So we'll get into a little more about how do we assess and improve the quality of a conversation. But high quality conversations create the kind of connection that leads to unsupervised, committed action.
Which, when we're talking about high performance collaboration, is so critical, because it means I can trust that when we leave this setting, that the work that we just committed to is actually going to happen.
Right. That's why one of the things we say is the evidence of my leadership is what people do when I'm not around. Mm-hmm. If the only way my leadership is effective is if I'm standing there staring at someone doing something, I wouldn't call that leadership. Mm-hmm. So that spirit of a conversation that frees people to act, that's exciting. And those are high quality conversations. Mm-hmm. And the issue of timing, often what I want and what it's time for don't coincide. Mm-hmm. Years ago, an executive who was at that time a senior executive in Mars was touring a plant that had just been renovated in time for the production that was going to affect the holiday season, which for Mars, that's a big deal. So he went to that plant because they had this high velocity renovation, and this place was now ready for a new level of production. He wanted to go and tour it and appreciate people, and he just was really touched by it. And he, afterwards, as he was leaving, and several of the people, the senior leaders of that site, were with him as he was going out to get into a car and leave. And he turned and he said, "This factory is so beautiful." He said, "What you've done here, we're actually so proud to be associated with." And he looked across a field at an apartment complex over there. He said, "You can tell they don't care as much about their place as you do about yours. Look at the difference physically between that place and your place." He said, "And I hope that has you appreciate the work you've done." He left. they decided that he was requesting that they go clean up the apartment complex over there.
Oh, gosh.
For him, it was a moment of appreciation that what he wanted people to do was actually own what they'd done. Somebody was listening to it like it was a request for action.
Mm-hmm.
And he said what happened is they actually spent a ridiculous amount of time and money going over there, getting the people's permission, them getting all excited. Oh, you're going to spend all the money to renovate this thing? And they did all the sanding and repainting of this complex over there.
You know, it also makes me wonder a little bit about the context of him in that setting, because you said like they were listening for it as a request. I also wonder if they were listening for it as a critique. And if it's a setting where people are used to being critiqued, and if he had been so complimentary, they're waiting for the other shoe to drop. They're waiting for the but
That's a good point, yeah.
in the conversation. And so because they're listening for that but, they hear it.
Yeah.
Right. And so then they hear that as a thing that they have to go take care of.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, so there is something about what's the container in which something is occurring. So we talk about teamwork like it's happening just in this team right here, but most teams are happening in a broader context. And how are they connected to that context as well also matters.
Right. How does that shape how they're connecting to listening for
That's right.
whatever in connection with one another? Well, so let's dig into quality first. Quality builds quite a bit on what we were just talking about in the law of listening. So the last law, the second law. So in terms of quality, we are assessing that based on how much value or waste is being produced as a result of the conversation. And listening has a lot to do with that. So which one of you would like to talk about how one navigates the quality of their listening?
I'll take quality and you take time.
Okay, great.
Okay. Those of you who've worked with us before, you know that what we call the conversation meter is fundamental to our work, because it's a way to be able to see where a conversation is relative to the quality it's producing. And think of it like a 0 to 100 speedometer, where there's 4 quadrants. And the lowest is pretense, the second one is sincerity, the third is accuracy, the fourth is authenticity. The higher the score, the less supervision costs, and more you see people making successful, committed action. So that's what we want. Well, the low end is pretense, and that's when it's not safe and people aren't saying what they really think. You're either getting lying or withholding. Above that, it's the domain of sincere opinion. But if conversations are all based in sincere opinion, position power wins. And that actually limits the amount of intelligence that emerges in the conversation. Accurate conversations are conversations where we're carefully noticing what are the things in the world we all see and we all endorse that's true. Like what are facts that we all go, yep, there's no argument about those. And what are ways of talking about or explaining those facts that help us deal with them? That becomes a collective thinking effort. And we'll talk about that more a little bit later. But it means that we actually are sharing a view of reality and working together to figure out what to do with it. Above that are authentic conversations, which are conversations that are rooted in the things that people care most about. So if you have a conversation that's related to people's deepest values and purposes, of course they're self-supervising when they leave. We're going to give you in the show notes a little more access to the conversation meter, a short description of it, some graphics, but that's my 2.5-minute version.
I think one of the things that's really important to remember when we talk about the quality of the conversation is most conversations don't live exclusively in one of those 4 domains. Most of them have some oscillation among the 4 domains, and it's important to just recognize when the conversation has gone into one that's less valuable, and how do you actually be an agent of shifting it, not critique somebody for either being stuck in their sincere opinion or not speaking up when you thought they should have, but how can you actually engage them and to create the space where either they can move out of pretense and say what's on their mind, so create that safety, or help somebody to shift past their sincere opinion to start to see maybe there are some alternate ways to look at a circumstance or a set of facts that would be more productive or more valuable for what you're in together. But rarely is it just in one spot or the other. Many people have probably heard me say, I think conversation is team sport, because I'm not going to, by myself, always be reliable for making that shift out of pretense or out of sincerity. But if we're in it together, you can actually be a collaborator with me and actually help me to see like, oh, maybe there's another way to look at that.
Well, and I think that that's a really good point, that it's a dance across all of it all the time, that's just natural to human beings, that we're going to oscillate and find our place in different zones. So the game is about noticing where you are and getting better and better at noticing, oh, that's what accuracy is like. Oh, that's what it's like when I'm listening from a place of sincerity. Not, okay, well, I'm only winning if most of the time I'm in authenticity. No, winning is catching yourself and then being able to switch into another way, another mode of listening. And a great way to do that is just practicing watching TV or being in conversation with other people and going, oh, okay, that's what pretense looks like. I see. And it just helps you get better and better day to day, noticing what that actually looks and feels like.
That goes by so quickly, and it's so powerful that if you notice what other people fail to notice, you can do things other people would fail to do. Mm-hmm. So just cultivating noticing, where are we? You know, back when we were doing all the initial conversations that led to the vitality imperative, one of the things that we said about both the quality model, which is the conversation meter, and the timing model, which we'll get to in a moment, is they're designed to have you be able to diagnose, predict, and prescribe. So diagnose, where are we? So first there's noticing, where are we? Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm not saying this, so I'm in pretense. What has me be in pretense? I don't think I can cope with the consequences of saying what I really think. Okay, yeah, so at least I'm beginning. All right, well, what do I have to do? Who is it safe to talk to? It's my next move. Just noticing that. So if I diagnose, like, oh, where am I in the meter? Or if I diagnose, like watching one of those TV shows you're talking about or a movie, saying, oh, where's that on the meter? Then predict, if we didn't move from where it is, where can you tell this conversation is going to go? And we've done this with people. It's amazing how easy they can say, oh, I can tell you what, this is going to happen. This person's going to blow up and this one's going to leave the room. And all right, well then, what do you recommend? That's the prescribed part. Mm-hmm. One of the things I'd love, Emerose, for us to put in the show notes is the moving up the meter piece. Yep. Mm-hmm. It shows people when you do notice it and you say the future that's going to lead us to is not good, what do you do to move up the meter?
Yep. Yeah. So we'll have that resource to make it a little bit easier to locate yourself and then work on moving up. All right, then let's shift to timing. So what do we mean by timing, and what's the walkthrough of how people navigate that?
Well, I think the easiest way to talk about timing is what conversation is it time for? And are we actually clear what conversation we're having? Because I think so much messiness within teamwork happens because you think we're having one conversation and I think we're having a different conversation. Mm-hmm. So when I say, well, what conversation is it time for? There are 3 categories of conversation, and there's a few conversations inside each one. Again, this will go in the show notes. But there are aligned conversations. These are conversations where we're getting clear about what are we in together, so intersection around purpose or around results. Then there are the invent conversations where we need to come up with new ideas for how are we going to actually solve something. And then the invest conversations where we're actually getting ready to commit time, money, and resources to whatever it is that we're going to move forward. So all of those are the aligned conversations. What does it take for us to actually get everything together to move into action? So then action. Mm-hmm. And in the act conversations, we need to engage people that are going to have to take the action. Clarify, so are we actually clear about what we're asking people to do? And then close, which is, are people genuinely committed to the things they just said? More on that to come on one of the future laws, by the way. And then there's adjustment, which is, are we actually learning from the action that we've taken? And are we applying that learning to the next cycle? So if we were to say it in brief, it's align deeply, sufficient to take the next action. So you don't have to align on all the things that you're going to do for in perpetuity. We'd be sitting in rooms together and never actually doing anything. That only works if we get into action quickly. So act quickly, because we're only actually going to know how well aligned we are when we get into action. Now that only works if we adjust often. So that's the conversational timing. And there are times when I think we're having an aligned conversation and you think we're having an act conversation. This is what happened when he toured the building. He was having actually an appreciation. He was having an adjust conversation about how beautiful this was and just noting. Somebody else thought that they were having an engaged conversation where they were being called into action because it wasn't clear about what was actually being asked for. But the number of times that happens, one of the simplest stories I tell, and I tell it because it is so ridiculously simple to demonstrate how quick it is for us to get out of alignment with one another, is that I one time was with one of our colleagues, Juan Mobley, in a room of 100 people. He was standing at the front. People were in conversation. I walked to him with a stack of papers in my hand. And I said, should I hand these out? And he said, yes. And I proceeded to hand out the papers in my hand. Those of you who know Juan, he started glaring at me from the front of the room. Love you, Juan. And he has a particular piercing glare. So I very meekly come back to the front of the room with papers. And I'm like, yes. He says, what are you doing? I said, I'm handing out the papers. I just asked you and you said yes. And he said, I didn't mean now. Because in his mind, it was particularly clear that in the original conversation, I was going to hand them out at the end of the day. And in my mind, it was particularly clear that I had them in my hand and we were going to hand them out this minute. All of which is just to show that conversational timing, I thought we were having an act conversation. He thought we were having an aligned conversation about who was going to do it. And so if that between two professionals in the space can go sideways that quickly, just imagine how easy it is in everyday conversations for us to think, oh, you think we're making a decision. I think the decision's been made and I'm asking you to take action on it.
That's why the noticing thing, Ambrose, you said earlier, is so profoundly important. And it's why we say that connection is an art of correction, not perfection. Because there is no way that we all stay in some coincident relationship to a situation permanently. We have different experiences and different perceptions and different devotions that we are caring about. We are going to get off course. That's fine. And when we catch that moment, like your relationship with Juan is so deep and abiding and wonderful that moment was just an occasion for stopping and
laughing at each
other and actually moving on. And it did reveal something. If you actually in those moments really do learn and adjust, it tends to heal anything. It's amazing. A great adjust conversation returns the investment, whatever disappointments we just went through. And y'all had a little tiny adjust conversation right in front of the room. Just the laughing starts it.
And we'll talk more about learning in a future law. I do think that something that's clear in both of the stories that you just told is this piece about position power also. Well, power just in general and how that influences how people show up to conversation, what they think needs to happen after that. I don't think it's a coincidence that in both situations there was somebody with more authority that was speaking, and then the other people were listening for something they needed to do.
Oh, that's really good.
And I think we talked about this recently, but I said it with a group of people a couple weeks ago that a lot of time we think that the evidence of our value is action, like that we're doing something all the time is what shows that we're valuable. So hunting for, okay, well, what's the thing I need to be doing? I need to look busy. Instead of, well, what did we learn out of the thing we did? Or what was the quality of that thing that we executed on? And are we sure it hit the mark of wherever we wanted to go? But most of the time we're just listening for what's the thing I need to do? What's the thing I need to do? What's the thing I need to do?
That's why the conversations are so important in those moments for both of us to be able to check. John Winter, who's our head of operations, right after I was first named CEO, he called me one day and he said, do you know that all of the project managers stop what they're doing when you send them a Teams message? And I said, why would they do that? And he laughed and he said, because you're the CEO, so they think whatever you're asking requires immediate attention. So that was my responsibility in large part to notice that, but also to create the space for people to be able to ask me, do you need this now? When do you actually need this? And I think this idea about position power and how do we actually navigate that and be clear with each other about, in those conversations, are we actually asking people to take action? But I really appreciate this as just an awareness that when you have position power, people are listening to you like you're asking them to do something. Whether you are or not, that's the filter that they have on. Mine is that people are calling to complain about something. Right? That's most of the time when somebody's calling out, like if somebody's calling to engagement or something, it's something that they don't know how else to resolve. And so I'm getting whatever the complaint is, which by the way, isn't always very helpful because it means my listening is tuned for what's wrong.
Right.
And that can be really damaging for somebody who's not as attentive to it as you are. Because you're noticing, oh, I'm going into this listening for what's wrong. CEO of another company that we did significant work with came into it when the company was at risk of disappearing. Had been around for many years, got into big trouble. The previous CEO was dismissed, and this person was brought in because he was considered to be, in that industry, a very successful turnaround expert. Well, he came in and there was a lot wrong. I mean, it was serious stuff. It's like, if I was lucky enough after having severe injury hiking where I've got my jugular cut and a surgeon comes along, I'm not going to discuss with him what he does. He's going to make sure I don't die. And he's probably not worried about anything except stopping the blood and fixing the thing. And that's not comfortable and it's not. But having the person who that's their mandate in that moment where there's a huge amount that's wrong, as in our very existence is at risk, that's a certain kind of leading, like being the one who's going to tell the truth about what's wrong and we're going to deal with it. Well, he led that company to where it became healthy again. And he was still stuck in listening for what's wrong. And the way that he actually opened to the conversation about is that I'd been in a meeting with him and his executive team the previous afternoon. We were going to resume that meeting the following afternoon, but in the morning, people were in the offices doing things. And part of what happened in that previous one is that one of the executives realized from some things that were said in the meeting, there were some things that he did not know that other people had mentioned information sources. So he's sitting at a desk, actually being on the internet, searching for something. And the CEO walked by, I think thinking he was being funny or something, and said, "We don't pay people here to scan the internet. We pay them for real work." And he walked off. And this guy, you could just see that this kind of blood rush to his face. This is a very senior executive. This is said in a room in front of other people. So I went and talked to the CEO and I said, "Do you know what that just did?" He said, "Well, they know I'm kidding." I said, No, they don't. And so we got in this conversation about he had grown habituated to listen for what's wrong. And the transition for him is you got to listen for what's working that we're going to build on, because you've taken this place to an entirely different place where now you have to go from this centralized, save you from the jugular cut authority to this decentralized ownership of the future of this healthy company. And that means you have to be able to listen for health. You can't just listen for disease.
Mick, the thing that raises for me is back in our introduction, we talked about the distinction between value and waste, and I made the point that there's no neutral. And I think it's something that when we're talking about high performance collaboration, if you have position power, everything you say and everything you don't say and everything you do and everything you don't do is being judged and interpreted in ways sometimes that you mean and sometimes that you don't. And so the conversations are the work, for me, are the way to redeem that, to be sure that you're actually making your intentions explicit to people so that they actually can take the appropriate action. And we miss a lot of those moments.
Yeah, I think it's good to draw a little line back to the conversation we had before this about the law of listening. Because if what I'm saying doesn't produce the valuable impact I intend, like what happened with him in that story, I need to back up and say, what was I listening for that had me say that? Because listening generates speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And as a person with huge position power, to continually be conscious of what am I listening for and how is what I'm saying the evidence of that, that's an interesting ongoing reflection that starts to have people notice things that others fail to notice.
Well, these are helpful models that might seem like common sense, but they are not common practice. And so we invite you to reflect on their place and how they show up in your own work. We'll include resources in the show notes that dig into both the cycle of value a little bit more and the conversation meter so that you can utilize those, bring them back to your teams in whatever way you like. And this has been the Law of Connection. Up next, we'll dig into the law of authenticity, which is the higher end of value and a guide on how to generate more through authenticity.